It was a warm Saturday afternoon in Fairview, Oregon, and the park was alive with its typical bustle. Parents watched their children laugh and climb on the playground, joggers weaved through paths with their earbuds in, and a group of teens by the basketball court argued energetically about the game's score. Among the familiar faces was Carol Thompson, a proud longtime resident known for her sharp tongue and unsolicited advice. Carol's self-appointed role as the park's protector often meant she was quick to involve herself in others' business. That day, Carol's attention locked on a man sitting at a picnic table near the walking trail. He had dark skin, a strong build, and wore a crisp button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to combat the heat. In front of him was a leather notebook, and he wrote in it with intent focus. Most people might have seen him as another visitor enjoying the park's calm, but to Carol, he stood out. Her lips tightened as she muttered under her breath, "Who is he? Never seen him before. Probably doesn't live around here." Suspicion pricked at her thoughts as her hand hovered over her phone, contemplating a call. But Carol decided it was best to confront him herself. Straightening her shoulders, she marched across the park with determined clicks of her sandals on the pavement. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the park's hum. The man looked up from his notebook, startled but composed. "Yes?" he replied, his tone polite but curious. Carol crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "I don't recognize you. Are you from this neighborhood? We don't get many strangers around here." The man sighed quietly and closed his notebook with care. "I'm new in town," he explained. "Just taking in the park and getting familiar with the area." Carol narrowed her eyes, unconvinced. "New in town? Well, you can't just sit here loitering. People might start to feel uneasy." Before he could answer, Carol took a step back and fished a small canister from her purse. "I suggest you leave now, or I'll call the police. Or worse." The man raised his hands, palms open in a calming gesture. "Ma'am, I assure you, there's no reason for alarm. I'm not doing anything wrong." But Carol's assumptions had already taken hold. With no hesitation, she pressed the nozzle of her pepper spray and released a sharp burst into the air. The man staggered back, shielding his face with his arms. The acrid mist hit him, and he stumbled, coughing and wiping his burning eyes. Nearby joggers froze mid-stride, and parents turned away from their children to see what was happening. "Hey!" a woman's voice rang out. A jogger approached quickly, her phone already recording the scene. "What's going on?" "He wasn't doing anything." Carol hesitated, her confidence wavering as eyes from all around the park focused on her. Clutching the pepper spray tightly, she stammered. "He looked suspicious. I was protecting the neighborhood." The man straightened slowly, his reddened eyes blinking through the sting. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wiped his face, and then reached into his jacket. A metallic glint caught the sunlight as he pulled out a badge. "My name is Derek Hayes," he said, his voice steady despite the ordeal. "I'm Fairview's new police chief. I just moved here last week." A heavy silence fell over the park. Carol's face drained of color, and she stared at the badge in disbelief. The phones capturing the scene felt like courtroom evidence under an unrelenting spotlight. Carol stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. I didn't know." Chief Hayes didn't flinch. "I think you and I need to have a talk," he said, his tone calm but firm. The bystanders stood in stunned silence, exchanging glances. Some whispered in hushed tones. Others just watched, their phones still aimed at Carol. The pepper spray slipped from her trembling hand, landing with a soft clink on the pavement. Chief Hayes, his face red and eyes still watery, remained composed, a silent testament to patience and professionalism amid the tense atmosphere. He reached into his pocket, retrieved a bottle of water, and poured a bit into his palm to rinse his stinging eyes. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, holding out a tissue. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "Thank you, I'll be fine," Hayes replied, dabbing at his face. His tone was calm and measured, not angry, just deeply disappointed. Somehow, that felt worse to everyone watching. Carol opened her mouth, trying to form words, but nothing came out. The enormity of her actions was sinking in. Finally, she managed to stammer, I didn't know." Hayes turned to her, meeting her gaze with a calm but piercing look. "Didn't know what?" he asked. His question wasn't hostile, but it demanded reflection. The silence between them felt heavier than words. Carol stuttered, her face turning crimson. I thought you looked suspicious," she blurted, the justification sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Suspicious," Hayes repeated, his tone unchanging. Sitting at a picnic table, writing in a notebook, in broad daylight. The weight of his words rippled through the crowd. A few people exchanged knowing glances, their disapproval now apparent. Carol fumbled for an explanation. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," she mumbled, scanning the crowd for support. But no one came to her defense. The same people who once humored her overbearing tendencies now looked away, their expressions laced with discomfort and judgment. Hayes sighed softly and gestured to a bench nearby. "Let's sit and talk for a moment. I think there's a lot we need to unpack." Carol hesitated, glancing nervously at the park and the crowd, whose phones remained raised, capturing every second. With no escape, she reluctantly followed him and perched on the edge of the bench, as if the seat might ignite beneath her. Hayes spoke, his voice calm yet resonant, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "I understand that people want to feel safe in their communities. But safety doesn't come from making assumptions about someone based on their appearance or where they're from." Carol stared at the ground, her hands twisting together. "I didn't mean," she began, but Hayes interrupted gently but firmly. "Intentions matter, Miss Thompson, but actions matter more. What you did could have caused serious harm. And worse, it sends a message to everyone watching that it's okay to treat someone differently because they don't fit in." The crowd shifted uneasily, and a few murmurs of agreement rippled through. Carol's face flushed deeper as she absorbed his words. For the first time, she seemed genuinely reflective, the defensiveness in her posture fading. Hayes continued, his tone softening. "Building trust and understanding in a community takes effort. It starts with seeing people as individuals, not as threats." As he spoke, a group of kids wandered over from the playground. One boy, no older than 10, approached cautiously. Looking up at Hayes, he asked with wide eyes, "Are you really the new police chief?" Hayes smiled warmly and nodded. "Yes, I am. I'm here to help make this town better for everyone." The boy grinned. "That's cool. Are you going to catch bad guys?" Hayes chuckled softly, his composure finally easing. "Sometimes, sure. But my job is mostly about helping people and making sure everyone feels safe, no matter who they are." The boy's smile widened, and he ran back to his friends, chattering excitedly. The interaction drew a small smile from the crowd, easing some of the tension. Carol remained quiet, staring into her lap. Slowly, she looked up at Hayes. I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible but sincere. Hayes nodded, acknowledging her apology without dismissing the gravity of her actions. "Apologies are a start," he said. "But real change comes with actions." The park was quieter now, the earlier chaos replaced with a reflective stillness. Parents returned to watching their kids, joggers resumed their pace, and the crowd began to disperse. But the lesson left behind lingered in the air, a reminder that assumptions can do real harm, and that understanding is the first step toward a truly safe community. "Chief Hayes," the woman called out, her voice clear yet hesitant. She looked to be in her 40s, with a kind face framed by shoulder-length hair. Hayes turned toward her with an encouraging nod. "Yes, ma'am?" "I just wanted to say thank you," she began, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "Thank you for handling that situation with such grace. I think a lot of us learned something important that day." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and a few more hands went up. Hayes smiled, gesturing for the next speaker. "I'll take your questions, but first, I want to say this," he began, addressing the room again. "It's easy to point fingers or assign blame when something like this happens. But real change, real growth, comes from looking inward. It's not about shaming or dividing. It's about taking responsibility for our own actions and striving to do better." Carol felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent the past week drowning in guilt, self-pity, and fear of judgment. But Hayes' words didn't feel like an attack. They felt like a challenge, one she wasn't sure she had the strength to meet. As more people stood to speak, some sharing stories of their own biases, others thanking Hayes for his leadership, Carol remained silent. She felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her like never before. Toward the end of the forum, the mayor took the microphone again. "Thank you, Chief Hayes, and thank you to everyone who shared tonight," she said, her tone warm and hopeful. "We have a long road ahead, but forums like this are the first step toward becoming a stronger, more united community." The crowd broke into applause, but Carol's hands remained still in her lap. She stared at them, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. As the event concluded, people began to file out of the gym, many stopping to shake Hayes' hand or exchange a few words with him. Carol sat frozen in her seat, unsure whether to leave quietly or approach him. Finally, summoning all her courage, she rose and made her way toward the stage. The walk felt endless, each step weighed down by her own doubts. Hayes, noticing her approach, paused his conversation with a town official and turned toward her. "Chief Hayes," she began, her voice trembling. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Truly sorry. Not just for what I did, but for why I did it. I let my fears and assumptions cloud my judgment, and I hurt you. I hurt our community." The room had mostly emptied, but a few people lingered, watching the exchange. Hayes studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he extended his hand. "Apology accepted, Miss Thompson," he said firmly but kindly. "Now, the question is, what are you going to do with what you've learned?" Carol blinked, his words catching her off guard. I don't know yet," she admitted. "Start by listening," Hayes advised. "To others, to your community, and maybe even to yourself. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step counts." Carol nodded, a lump forming in her throat again. "Thank you," she whispered, gripping his hand briefly before turning to leave. As she walked out of the gym and into the cool evening air, Carol felt the sting of shame still lingering, but for the first time, it was joined by a glimmer of hope. Change wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary, and it had to start with her. Behind her, the gym lights dimmed, and Fairview's newest police chief stood, already preparing for the challenges and opportunities ahead in a community that, like Carol, was learning to grow. As the gym emptied, Carol lingered, sitting quietly on the edge of a chair near the back. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the past week. She couldn't shake the weight of her actions, nor the path that had brought her to this moment. The community forum had been an eye-opener, but it was Chief Hayes' grace and composure that had struck her the most. After the last attendees left, Carol rose to her feet and walked toward the stage. Her steps were slow, hesitant, as if each one required its own moment of courage. Hayes was still there, speaking with the mayor and a few volunteers. When he noticed Carol approaching, he paused, giving her his full attention. "Miss Thompson," he greeted, his tone neutral but not unkind. Carol hesitated, clutching her purse tightly. "Chief Hayes," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you said today." Hayes nodded, waiting for her to continue. "And," Carol added, her eyes lowering, "I want to apologize again. For the park, for what I did. I know I've already said it, but I need you to know I truly regret it." There was a moment of silence between them before Hayes spoke. "I appreciate that," he said. "Acknowledging what happened is important, but what matters now is what you do moving forward." Carol nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing. "I want to do better," she said earnestly. "I'm just not sure where to start." Hayes offered a small smile. "Start by listening," he said. "By understanding the experiences of people who are different from you. And when you find yourself uncomfortable, ask why. Growth isn't supposed to be easy, but it's worth it." Carol took his words to heart. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. The whispers around town and the relentless online chatter about the incident had made her avoid social media for days, but now she knew she needed to face the consequences directly. With a deep breath, she began typing. "I want to address what happened at the park last weekend. What I did was wrong, and there's no excuse for my actions. I let fear and ignorance guide me, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I've learned a lot from this experience, and I'm committed to doing better, not just for myself, but for our community. I hope we can all reflect on how we treat each other and work together to build a place where everyone feels welcome. Her finger hovered over the post button for what felt like an eternity before she finally pressed it. She closed her eyes, bracing for the flood of responses. To her surprise, the comments were not as harsh as she had feared. Many people appreciated her apology and her willingness to take accountability. Others shared their own reflections, admitting their own biases and expressing a desire for change. Carol's post became a catalyst for a broader conversation, one that extended beyond her and Hayes to the entire community. A few days later, Carol received a message from Chief Hayes. It was brief but meaningful, a thank you for her public apology, and an invitation to join a newly formed community advisory board aimed at addressing bias and fostering inclusivity in Fairview. At first, Carol hesitated. She didn't feel she deserved such an opportunity. But Hayes' words echoed in her mind. What matters now is what you do moving forward. With a deep breath, she replied, accepting the invitation. Months later, the Community Advisory Board held its first major event, the Fairview for All town meeting. The high school gym, where the park incident had once cast a shadow, was now filled with tables showcasing local cultural groups, charities, and discussion panels. The room buzzed with energy, laughter, and conversation. Carol was there, not as a passive attendee, but as an active participant. She had worked tirelessly with the board to plan the event, pouring her energy into understanding and uplifting the community she had once viewed so narrowly. At her station, she greeted attendees warmly and handed out flyers for dialogue sessions on unconscious bias. While engaging with visitors, she noticed a familiar face, a young boy from the park, the one who had asked Chief Hayes about catching bad guys. He approached, holding his mother's hand. "Hi," Carol said with a warm smile. "Do you remember me?" The boy tilted his head. "You were there when the chief got pepper sprayed," he said bluntly. Carol winced at his honesty, but she nodded. "That's right," she said softly. "I made a big mistake that day, but I've been learning how to do better. And guess what? The chief and I are working together now to make sure everyone feels welcome here." The boy studied her for a moment, then grinned. "Cool. Do you get to catch bad guys too?" Carol chuckled, shaking her head. "Not quite. I'm helping people learn to be kind to each other instead." The boy's mother smiled and led him to another table, but Carol couldn't help feeling a small sense of pride. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but moments like this reminded her she could shape the future. As the event wound down and volunteers began cleaning up, Hayes approached Carol. "Looks like the event was a success," he said. Carol nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "It's a start," she said. "There's still a lot of work to do, but it feels good to be part of the solution." Hayes smiled. "Growth isn't easy, but it's worth it," he reminded her. Carol returned the smile, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time, she truly understood what he meant. Growth wasn't about erasing mistakes or making amends in one grand gesture. It was about the small, consistent steps toward becoming better, for herself and for her community. As the last attendees left and the gym lights dimmed, Carol stayed behind to help clean up. The quiet of the room felt different now, not heavy with shame, but filled with hope. She looked around and thought about how far she had come. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, she felt she was on the right path. The moral of the story was clear. True change begins when we confront our flaws and choose to grow. It's not about erasing mistakes but learning from them, building bridges where there were once walls, and striving to create a world where everyone feels they belong.